December 22, 1944. A freezing night in the Ardennes, the wind cut like a blade, and snow buried the forest in silence. Soldiers, expecting gunfire and orders, stumbled upon something no one could have imagined. A little girl, alone, shivering in the ruins of a farmhouse. One blanket, meant for a whole squad, became the difference between life and death. And the soldier who gave it? He risked everything, even his own survival. This is a story of mercy in the middle of war, a moment that went against every rule, every order, every expectation. What happened next would shock even the hardest soldiers. Don't miss the full story. Watch till the end, like, subscribe, and support the channel to see how a single act of kindness changed a life in the heart of the Ardennes. December 16, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge had begun with thunder that shook the forest from its roots. By the week before Christmas, the Ardennes had become a world of snow and silence, where white camouflage mixed with white shrouds. The air stung of cordite and frozen diesel. The smell of pine sap and gun oil clung to everything. In this world of iron and frost, armies moved like ghosts. For the Americans of the 99th Infantry Division, supplies were as scarce as warmth itself. They called it the Ghost Front before the attack, a quiet sector meant for rest. But the quiet turned out to be a trap. Hitler's last gamble, Wacht am Rhein, struck through the fog with nearly 200,000 German troops and 600 tanks. The temperature fell below 20 degrees Celsius. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets. An artilleryman from Battery C later wrote, "You couldn't tell where the snow ended and the sky began. The world had turned white, and we were dying in it. Their overcoats froze stiff, their boots turned to shells. Yet amid the chaos, Belgian civilians still lingered in farmhouses and cellars, too poor, too proud, or too paralyzed to flee. The paradox was clear. Men with rifles and rations were often hungrier than the families they stumbled upon. American supply convoys stretched for miles, but only a trickle reached the front. A quartermaster's report from December 21st noted that winter gear arrives faster than it can be distributed. There were enough blankets in Antwerp for every soldier twice over, but too few trucks and too much ice between them. As the lines buckled, small towns like Stoumont, Stavelot, and Malmedy became sanctuaries and slaughterhouses by turns. German SS units executed prisoners in the snow, while American medics shared canned peaches with terrified children. One radio operator remembered the contradiction vividly. "We were told to dig in and shoot anything moving. That same day I gave a chocolate bar to a boy who couldn't have been more than 6. In one village, the records never name it, only a grid square on an after-action map, a patrol found a stone cottage split by mortar fire. Inside, they heard coughing. They expected Germans. Instead, they found a little girl, barefoot, her face ash-gray from smoke. This would become the story of the blanket. But before that moment, there was only exhaustion and disbelief. The GIs had seen towns obliterated, comrades frozen mid-step. They had stopped believing in miracles, and yet one would happen, not with gunfire or orders, but with an act of warmth amid the coldest winter Europe had known in half a century. A veteran later said, "We had tanks and planes, but that night it was a piece of wool that changed everything." The storm deepened. Snow thickened the silence. In the next days, the front would collapse, and the soldiers who survived would be pushed to their limits of endurance and conscience. But somewhere, amid the wreckage and retreat, a nameless private would make a decision that no manual could justify, to give away the one thing that kept him alive. And so, in that frozen world where orders froze before they were spoken, humanity thawed for a moment. What happened next would be remembered not in statistics or strategy, but in the quiet breath of a child under an American blanket. He was 21 years old, a farm boy from Iowa, the kind who knew the weight of work before the weight of a rifle. His name, recorded only once in a quartermaster's log, was Private First Class Thomas Riley. He had landed in France in September 1944 with the 99th Infantry Division, the Checkerboard Division, and had not seen home since. His mother had sewn his initials into the corner of his Army-issue blanket before he shipped out. By December, that blanket was more than comfort. It was survival. Soldiers called it GI Gold. Made of olive drab wool, 3.5 pounds each, standard issue across 12 million men, it trapped heat even when soaked, though it stank of lanolin and smoke. Every night Riley rolled himself into it like armor against the cold. Every morning frost clung to its folds like glass dust. The paradox was brutal. The U.S. Army, the best supplied force in history, was running short of everything that mattered most. Gasoline froze in jerrycans. Rations turned to ice bricks. The statistics told the story better than any diary could. Over 60,000 soldiers were treated for frostbite or trench foot during the Ardennes campaign, more than the number wounded by enemy fire in some sectors. Blankets, parkas, and gloves, millions were made, but only hundreds reached the front in time. In the blacked-out nights, Riley and his squad slept in foxholes, roofed with pine boughs and snow. The sound was a steady rhythm, breath, wind, distant artillery. They ate K rations that smelled of metal and damp cardboard. When they did get warm, it was from the engine heat of passing Sherman tanks or from wrapping together under one tarp. Then came the night of December 22nd. The wind cut like barbed wire. Their unit had been pushed back through the forest near Trois Ponts. Riley had only what was on his back, an M1 rifle, a pack half empty of rations, and that single wool blanket. As they stumbled toward what they hoped was an Allied checkpoint, they found the ruins of a farmhouse. Inside, under the broken beams and snow-smeared windows, was the girl. 8, maybe 9. Filthy, trembling, barefoot in a threadbare dress. She didn't cry, she just stared. One man muttered, "She's German." Another said, "She's just cold." The squad leader barked for them to move. "We can't stop. Orders say regroup at the road." Riley hesitated. The girl coughed once, dry and hollow. He knelt, pulled the blanket from his pack, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't understand his words, but she understood the gesture. Her small hands clutched the fabric like it was life itself. A medic with them, Corporal Leo Sadowski, later wrote in his journal, "He gave up his blanket, didn't say a word, just did it." The girl smiled. "First time I'd seen anyone smile that week. I told him he'd freeze without it. He said, 'She needs it more than me.' That was all." The next morning, Riley's squad moved on. He walked slower than the rest. The wind cut deeper. By dawn, frost glazed his jacket. When they reached the next village, he was shaking uncontrollably, his lips blue. He refused to take another man's blanket. The irony! The strongest armies in history could burn through 1,000 tons of fuel a day, but still depended on one man's kindness to prove they hadn't turned to ice inside. When the sun rose over the frozen fields, Riley's blanket remained in the ruins behind them, wrapped around a sleeping child. This wasn't heroism written for newspapers. It was a quiet defiance against the cold, and against the logic of war itself. But the story didn't end there. Someone would return to that farmhouse days later, and the reports they filed would preserve both the act and its consequence. He was 21 years old, a farm boy from Iowa, the kind who knew the weight of work before the weight of a rifle. His name, recorded only once in a quartermaster's log, was Private First Class Thomas Riley. He had landed in France in September 1944 with the 99th Infantry Division, the Checkerboard Division, and had not seen home since. His mother had sewn his initials into the corner of his Army-issue blanket before he shipped out. By December, that blanket was more than comfort. It was survival. Soldiers called it GI Gold. Made of olive drab wool, 3.5 pounds each, Standard issue across 12 million men, it trapped heat even when soaked, though it stank of lanolin and smoke. Every night Riley rolled himself into it like armor against the cold. Every morning frost clung to its folds like glass dust. The paradox was brutal. The U.S. Army, the best supplied force in history, was running short of everything that mattered most. Gasoline froze in jerrycans. Rations turned to ice bricks. The statistics told the story better than any diary could. Over 60,000 soldiers were treated for frostbite or trench foot during the Ardennes campaign, more than the number wounded by enemy fire in some sectors. Blankets, parkas, and gloves, millions were made, but only hundreds reached the front in time. In the blacked-out nights, Riley and his squad slept in foxholes, roofed with pine boughs and snow. The sound was a steady rhythm, breath, wind, distant artillery. They ate K-rations that smelled of metal and damp cardboard. When they did get warm, it was from the engine heat of passing Sherman tanks or from wrapping together under one tarp. Then came the night of December 22nd. The wind cut like barbed wire. Their unit had been pushed back through the forest near Trois Ponts. Riley had only what was on his back, an M1 rifle, a pack half empty of rations, and that single wool blanket. As they stumbled toward what they hoped was an Allied checkpoint, they found the ruins of a farmhouse. Inside, under the broken beams and snow-smeared windows, was the girl. 8, maybe 9. Filthy, trembling, barefoot in a threadbare dress. She didn't cry, she just stared. One man muttered, "She's German." Another said, "She's just cold." The squad leader barked for them to move. "We can't stop. Orders say regroup at the road." Riley hesitated. The girl coughed once, dry and hollow. He knelt, pulled the blanket from his pack, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't understand his words, but she understood the gesture. Her small hands clutched the fabric like it was life itself. A medic with them, Corporal Leo Sadowski, later wrote in his journal, "He gave up his blanket, didn't say a word, just did it." The girl smiled. First time I'd seen anyone smile that week. I told him he'd freeze without it. He said, "She needs it more than me." That was all. The next morning, Riley's squad moved on. He walked slower than the rest. The wind cut deeper. By dawn, frost glazed his jacket. When they reached the next village, he was shaking uncontrollably, his lips blue. He refused to take another man's blanket. The irony! The strongest armies in history could burn through 1,000 tons of fuel a day, but still depended on one man's kindness to prove they hadn't turned to ice inside. When the sun rose over the frozen fields, Riley's blanket remained in the ruins behind them, wrapped around a sleeping child. This wasn't heroism written for newspapers. It was a quiet defiance against the cold and against the logic of war itself. But the story didn't end there. Someone would return to that farmhouse days later, and the reports they filed would preserve both the act and its consequence. She had no name in the records, only a fragment. One female child, approximately 8 years old, found near destroyed structure, sector N392. The war had erased her identity long before the soldiers arrived, yet through the accounts that survived, a shape emerges, small, thin, barefoot in snow, a figure of silence in a world that spoke only in explosions. Before the Americans came, she had lived in a farming village on the outskirts of Stavelot. Her father, a railway worker, had been drafted into the Wehrmacht and never returned from the Eastern Front. Her mother was killed when the Luftwaffe's own fuel dump exploded under Allied bombardment in November. Since then, the girl had survived on root vegetables and the charity of neighbors until even that ran out. When the front shifted, she hid in the ruins, wrapped in an old shawl and waiting for a sound that wasn't gunfire. The paradox of her existence. She belonged to the side the Americans were fighting, yet she would live because one of them refused to see her as the enemy. The Ardennes winter was merciless. Temperatures reached 25 overcame at night. Civilians trapped between lines froze by the dozens. U.S. Army Medical Corps estimates later listed over 1,000 civilian frostbite cases in Belgium alone that month. A Belgian priest who moved among the refugees wrote in his diary, "The snow swallowed sound. Even prayers froze before they could reach heaven." The little girl became one of the faceless millions displaced by war. 11 million children in Europe without homes, 500,000 in Belgium alone. But she would be remembered not by name, but by a gesture, a coarse wool blanket, olive drab and smelling of smoke, that became her lifeline. When she was found again, 2 days after Riley's patrol had passed through, she was still alive. A medical corpsman from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion wrote in his report, "Child located at 1,000 HRs, body temp dangerously low but conscious, wrapped in U.S. issue blanket, initials TR, stitched in corner, treated for exposure and malnutrition." Later testimony from a field nurse, Lieutenant Mary Delacroix, described the moment in a letter home. "She didn't speak, only watched us with those pale eyes. She held the blanket close to her face as though it were a living thing. When I tried to take it for washing, she cried, a sound so small it hurt to hear. We let her keep it." Smell, texture, sound. Every sense tells the same story. The rough weave of army wool, the faint scent of lanolin and tobacco, the whisper of breath beneath fabric. For a child who had lost everything, this blanket wasn't just warmth. It was proof that compassion could survive where entire cities had not. As the snowstorm raged, she was moved with other civilians to a temporary refuge near Spa, Belgium. She slept on straw beneath a tarp. Doctors fed her hot broth and white bread, her first warm meal in weeks. When the medical officer asked her name, she whispered one word they could not understand. But when he asked who gave her the blanket, she simply said, "Amerikaner." A paradox lingered in every telling afterward. A German child saved by the enemy, a soldier dying from cold while she lived through his sacrifice. Later, historians would piece together the logistics, the movements, the numbers. But they would never fully recover her story, because in war, statistics bury names faster than snow buries bodies. She survived the winter. Records suggest she was taken in by a Belgian family near Liège after the fighting ended. And though her trail fades into the blur of post-war reconstruction, the blanket with the stitched initials TR was catalogued and stored by the U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division in February 1945. It was a small piece of cloth, but it carried the weight of 2 lives intertwined, and soon others would take notice. Medics, officers, and reporters, who saw in this act something that defied every military logic they had been taught. By the first week of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had turned from chaos to endurance. The Americans had halted the German advance, but at a terrible cost, 89,000 casualties, including frostbite, exposure, and missing personnel. Behind the front, clerks and medics began the quieter work of collecting the war's paper trail, reports, testimonies, and field notes scribbled in pencil on damp notepads. Among them appeared a handful of fragments that told a very different kind of story. It began with a short notation from a supply sergeant attached to the 326th Medical Company. Recovered child, female, approx 8 years old, wearing U.S. blanket, ID stenciled TR. Said to have been given by unknown GI near Trois Ponts. The detail might have gone unnoticed, except that the sergeant's commanding officer, Captain Harold M. Lewis, added a line in the margin, "Find this soldier." Witness accounts trickled in. One came from Corporal Leo Sadowski, the medic who had marched with Riley's patrol. In his after-action statement dated January 6th, he wrote, "We came across a collapsed farmhouse at grid 382. There was a little girl inside near the hearth, no shoes, blue with cold." Part Riley gave her his blanket. "I told him he'd freeze without it. He said, 'She needs it more than me.' He was alive when we left. A week later, we heard he'd gone down with exposure. The Army's Bureau of Public Relations, desperate for morale stories amid the bloodbath of the Ardennes, seized upon this account. A field correspondent from Stars and Stripes tracked down Sadowski near Eupen and asked him for a quote. He declined at first. It wasn't for show, he said. He didn't do it for the papers. But the story spread anyway, stripped of names and simplified into an allegory of American kindness in the heart of war. In the official record it appeared only once more, in a January 12th memorandum from the 1st U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division. Example of conduct reflecting humane treatment toward non-combatant persons under extreme conditions. Recommend commendation if identification can be confirmed. No commendation was ever issued. Thomas Riley's body was found near Spa, frozen where he had collapsed during the retreat, his tags intact, but his blanket missing. Yet the witnesses who remembered him wrote in tones that blurred report and confession. Sadowski again, in a private letter to his brother, "They say war shows what men are made of. Maybe it shows what we were meant to be before all this. He gave warmth when there was none left." Captain Lewis added another paradox in his final debrief. "We measured heroism in confirmed kills and tonnage moved, but some victories don't fit in ledgers." Even the field nurse, Lieutenant Delacroix, added a quiet postscript in her own notebook. "When I tucked in the child that night, I felt his presence, not as a ghost, but as the warmth that lingered in that blanket. That's the kind of immortality soldiers don't get medals for." In total, 6 separate testimonies mentioned the event. Each used different words, but the tone was the same: subdued awe, disbelief, and a hint of guilt. The story moved through the ranks like a rumor that refused to die, passed from mess tents to chaplain sermons. The Army's final report on the Ardennes, published later in 1945, would record the campaign as one of logistics and steel: 183,000 German troops, 600 tanks, 1,000 Allied guns. But buried among the appendices, a single footnote read, "Unidentified act of kindness observed by 99th Infantry personnel near Trois Ponts, Decourne 22, 1944. That was all. A single line swallowed by statistics. And yet, among the men who had seen it, it mattered more than any figure. It was proof that compassion hadn't frozen solid in the snows of Belgium. But to understand why that one blanket and that one choice meant so much, we must look at the greater picture, the material reality of the front, where scarcity itself became a moral test. When the story of the blanket incident reached regimental headquarters, it didn't travel as legend. It arrived as a problem. The Army ran on discipline, not sentiment. And yet here was a private who had willingly deprived himself of issued equipment, an act that technically violated Field Regulation 85-12, retention of essential gear under combat conditions. A military bureaucracy built for invasion didn't know how to process compassion. Captain Harold Lewis, who had initiated the inquiry, was summoned to a divisional briefing near Spa on January 10, 1945. There, amid stacks of frost-covered reports and cigarette smoke, he was asked the same question 3 times. "Did this man disobey a direct order?" Lewis paused before replying. He followed a higher one. The paradox was glaring. In a system that measured success by tonnage and territory, one soldier's act of empathy had no numerical value. Yet the men who heard the story whispered about it with reverence, as if it reminded them why they were human. Across the front, soldiers were being court-martialed for theft of food, hoarding fuel, and abandoning posts. In contrast, Riley's offense was the mirror image of those crimes, giving away too much. In the bitter cold of January, that contradiction struck officers and chaplains alike as something worth preserving. The chaplain of the 99th Division, Lieutenant Reverend Robert Thayer, wrote a sermon for the following Sunday service. "We are soldiers, but we are also caretakers of what remains good. The test of manhood is not how much we can endure, but what warmth we keep alive in others. Men wept quietly under their helmets, not for the fallen alone, but for the strange idea that kindness could be an act of defiance. War compresses morality into seconds. Commanders weigh lives against objectives. Conscience, when it appears, must whisper louder than artillery. Lieutenant Thayer later noted that among the 1,500 men he ministered to that month, the story of the blanket circulated more than any order or bulletin. They called him the soldier who kept someone else warm, he wrote. They needed that story more than any ration. In the weeks that followed, discussions of morale filled Army memos. Officially, morale was defined in tons of mail delivered, hot meals served, and rotations granted. But on the ground, it was measured in smaller currencies, shared cigarettes, half canteens of coffee, the warmth of a blanket offered without condition. Even some commanders began to reconsider the arithmetic of survival. A colonel in the 99th wrote privately to his superior, "If discipline alone could win wars, the Germans would have already won. What keeps us moving is something else, something that can't be ordered." Riley's story challenged the boundaries of military thinking. His act blurred the line between duty and conscience, regulation and rebellion. The war machine had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes humanity disobeys. Back in the States, the Stars and Stripes version of the story, sanitized, unnamed, circulated through training camps. It was retitled The Blanket That Saved Two Souls. The irony wasn't lost on those who had been there. Only one of those souls had survived. Yet even this distortion served a purpose. In a war defined by machinery, 50,000 tanks, 90,000 aircraft, 16 million uniforms, the story of one piece of wool traveled further than any convoy. Private Sadowski would later write, "Orders kept us alive, but that blanket reminded us why we deserved to be." In the end, the Army didn't punish anyone. The case was quietly closed with a single note: no action required. But among those who had read the file, something shifted. They began to understand that the line between regulation and mercy was thinner than a blanket's edge. And when the snow finally began to melt in February and the frozen roads turned to rivers of mud, the story, half rumor, half gospel, continued to move with the men who carried it. Because what came next was not just memory, but transformation, how one act of warmth would echo far beyond that frozen farmhouse. When the thaw came in March 1945, the Ardennes released what the snow had hidden: rifles, boots, letters, and bodies. Villages that had been battlefields became ghost towns, scattered with fragments of both armies. Amid this landscape, stories drifted like embers that refused to die. The blanket story, as it came to be called, began its second life, no longer a field incident, but a parable whispered across mess halls, hospitals, and home-front kitchens. The official Army correspondence closed the matter in January, yet traces of it appeared everywhere. In a letter dated February 14th, Lieutenant Delacroix wrote to her sister in New York, "The girl has recovered. Her cheeks are pink again. She sleeps with that same blanket wrapped tight every night. I can't explain it. It's as if she's carrying the warmth of that soldier inside it." The child was relocated with a group of civilian refugees to a convent near Liège. The nuns, unfamiliar with her German dialect, called her Anna, after Saint Anne, protector of the lost. In one inventory ledger, they recorded possessions: one wool U.S. Army blanket, initials TR. By spring, the story had filtered into newspapers. Stars and Stripes ran a short column under the headline, "A Soldier's Blanket, a Child's Life." It carried no names, only the details: an American GI, a German girl, and a frozen night in Belgium. Editors called it a human moment amid the inhuman. At first it was treated as propaganda, a counterweight to reports of the Malmedy massacre, where 84 American POWs had been murdered by SS troops. The contrast was deliberate, brutality answered by mercy. But as veterans returned home, the story reappeared in their letters, journals, and reunions, stripped of politics, retold in reverence. Sergeant Paul Mendel of the 99th Division wrote in a 1948 reunion bulletin, "We saw cities burn and men break. But I'll never forget that night, not because of death, but because someone chose life." Historians would later dig for corroboration. They found the Army file, the medic's note, and the quartermaster's inventory. The facts aligned enough to prove it happened, even if the names were lost to time. The paradox remained. A war that devoured millions could still produce a single act that refused to vanish. The blanket itself survived. It was sent from the convent to the American Graves Registration Command in April 1945, tagged and stored as personal effect, unclaimed. When a clerk unpacked it, he found the initials TR stitched in fading thread. Decades later, it would reappear again. In 1984, at a small museum in Bastogne, donated anonymously with a note that read, "He gave it to save her. She lived." Eyewitness memory faded with time, but the story persisted, adapted, translated, mythologized. Some versions claimed the girl later emigrated to America. Others said she left flowers on unknown graves every Christmas. None can be proven. All carry truth in spirit. An old Belgian farmer who had been a boy during the occupation recalled in a 1990 interview, "My father told me the Americans brought machines and chocolate, but that one soldier, he brought something else. He brought back the idea that mercy still existed." Numbers fade, records decay, but oral memory clings where documents cannot. Among veterans of the Ardennes, the blanket became shorthand for decency under fire, the reminder that courage wasn't only about standing one's ground, but about giving part of oneself away. The fields that once froze men solid now bloom with poppies each spring. Tourists walk the same forest paths and see memorials of stone and steel, but none of those monuments carry the warmth of wool or the heartbeat of the man who offered it. The memory endures quietly, in the way soldiers still speak of compassion as a kind of rebellion, in the way history still searches for proof of grace amid atrocity. And that search, that refusal to let kindness disappear, would shape the final meaning of this story. Because long after the battle ended, the real victory lay not in conquest, but in conscience. By the close of 1945, the Ardennes had returned to silence. The snow had melted, and the pines stood bare against the gray European sky. Entire divisions had marched through, tanks and trucks crunching over frozen mud, yet one small act, the giving of a blanket, outlasted them all in human memory. The paradox was undeniable. Armies measured victory in territory, tonnage, and casualties, yet a single private's compassion resonated more than any statistic. Historians later noted that acts like Riley's were invisible in the grand narrative. The official figures tell of 89,000 American casualties and 67,000 German losses in the Ardennes, of tanks destroyed and supply lines severed. But these numbers, massive and impersonal, obscure the subtle truths. A child survived. A man gave up his warmth, and the essence of humanity persisted even amid mechanized slaughter. The little girl, Anna, grew up carrying both the memory and the physical presence of that blanket. In interviews decades later, she recalled, "I didn't know his name. I only knew the wool, the smell, the warmth. I survived because someone chose me over himself. I carry that choice with me every day." The paradox of war is often framed as brutality versus heroism, tyranny versus liberty. In the Ardennes, it was something quieter, more intimate, warmth versus frostbite, empathy versus orders, life versus survival. Riley had come as a soldier, a tool of military strategy, but left as a moral actor, an example that even in chaos, small choices echo across lifetimes. This story also widened perspectives beyond individuals. It reminds nations that power is measured not only in bombs dropped or tanks deployed, but in the ethical acts that survive history's cold arithmetic. The United States, so often defined by its industrial abundance, found its moral strength reflected in one blanket and one choice. In the end, the machinery of war cannot guarantee humanity. Only the people operating it can. By spring 1945, when the Allies crossed into Germany, veterans carried the story home. Letters, reunions, and memoirs spread the account across continents. Educators, historians, and journalists would later cite it as an example of conscience prevailing over regulation, of mercy prevailing over cruelty. And while Thomas Riley did not survive the winter, his decision shaped generations, a testament to what war could not crush: empathy. They had come as conquerors, they left as students. And in that paradox lies the enduring lesson. The greatest weapon in war is not always firepower. Sometimes it is the courage to surrender what sustains you, to save another, to assert life when all else is death. In the end, America's abundance was not just measured in tanks, rations, or weapons. Its truest strength lay in choices like Riley's, acts of simple humanity that could bridge enemy lines, warm frozen bodies, and outlive the violence itself. The Ardennes, for all its frost and fire, remained a testament that even in the most calculated theaters of war, conscience writes its own history.